our next speaker is going to be Terry Horgan. Now, I wanted to introduce Terry, so it's now technically his talk time, because yesterday he expressed a hope to me that the election would be called during his talk, and it wasn't. But I've just been informed that the AP has called the election for Biden. So now it is Terry's, so now that has technically happened within sort of Terry's, at least his talk time. A little good news, and hopefully some good phenomenological feelings and thoughts for
relief,
if nothing else. And you know, if we're so Terry's going to talk now, and we do have a few minutes before Michelle's talk is scheduled for 11:15. So, you know, if we still have some questions for Terry or David, hopefully, you know, we can maybe go a little long then to do that. But with all that said, let me turn it over to Terry now.
Okay, thanks. Yes, 5 minutes ago, my wife handed me a note. So yes, I got the news, the very good news. Okay, I want to give a very big picture kind of talk. My title is Mental Content in the Analytic Tradition, Phenomenal Intentionality versus Received Wisdom. So I'm going to take us back to mid-20th century, a text by Gilbert Ryle called The Concept of Mind. It was a definitive articulation of a position that came to be called analytical behaviorism. The basic idea being that mental concepts and attributions of mentality are basically a matter of attributing various kinds of behavioral dispositions to people. That's what it's all about, hence behaviorism. And it was called analytic behaviorism because this was supposed to be a product of conceptual analysis. You know, this is what mental concepts really amount to. They're behavioral disposition concepts. Next big event in the broad history of analytic philosophy of mind, I think, comes, say, at the end of the 1950s, beginning of the 1960s. U.T. Place and J.J.C. Smart, they liked analytical behaviorism with regard to some aspects of mentality or with regard to some mental concepts and attributions, but they thought, wait a minute, there's more to mentality than just dispositions to behavior. There are certain kinds of mental states that have an intrinsic occurrent aspect to them, and the most vivid cases were sensations. There's this intrinsic what it's like of sensory experience. And so you found Place and Smart defending a psychophysical identity theory regarding sensory experiences. There are these things, they're not just behavioral dispositions. And by the way, if you want to be a good materialist, you should identify sensations with brain processes. So there's an acknowledgement that at least some aspects of mentality are intrinsic, qua mental, and they're not just a matter of dispositions to behavior. Very shortly thereafter, or right about the same time really, the beginning of the 1960s, Hilary Putnam famously starts defending functionalism, initially thinking about minds and machines, you know, thinking about whether robots could have mentality. And he was thinking about the idea that when you talk the lingo of computers and computer science, you describe computational states in a rather abstract way, so that a computational system involving various interacting computational states could be physically embodied in different ways. So his idea was that mental state types should be identified with state types whose essence is their causal functional role in a cognitive system. Basically, they're dispositions to cause and be caused by other states who are also characterizable in terms of their functional role within the whole system, and in relation to inputs from sensory sources and behavioral outputs. The functionalist picture came to dominate in philosophy of mind. I would say it probably still is the dominant and received view in analytic philosophy of mind. It's important to realize that there was a type of psychophysical identity theory coming out about this same time, mid-1960s, I'd say, that combined some of the thinking in Putnam-style functionalism with the impulse to identify mental states with physical brain states. Not just talking about sensations now, but talking about all mental states. The locus classicus, well, there were two. There was the work of David Armstrong in Australia. I think he wrote a book called The Materialist Theory of Mind, maybe around 1964. Famous paper by David Lewis in 1966 called An Argument for the Identity Theory. Now, the thing about that kind of view was that it took over something of the spirit of Putnam-style functionalism. The thought was that the essence of any mental state type as such, its essence qua mental, was just a matter of functional role. Typical cause connections among these internal states and in how they are caused by sensory inputs and how sometimes collectively they cause behavioral outputs. But this was treated as an analysis of mental concepts, functionalist analysis of mental concepts. But the claim was that the states that actually fill these functionally defined causal roles are brain states. So I call that kind of view first order functionalism, which is a type identity theory. Sometimes it's called filler functionalism, and the official kind of Putnam style functionalism is sometimes called role functionalism. If you're a Putnam functionalist, you think mental states have an essence that's causal, functional, and they're multiply realizable by different kinds of physical possible states. If you're the first order kind of functionalist, you say, well, mental states are identical to physical states, and they might be identical to different kinds of physical states and different kinds of possible creatures. Pain might be something different in Martians than it is in humans. But what makes it pain in both cases is that it plays the definitive pain role, and that's a causal role. All right, so philosophy of language is still dominant in relation to philosophy of mind in this period, mid-century, but that begins to change. Philosophy of mind begins to be more the locus of sort of non-normative theorizing and analytic philosophy as compared to philosophy of language. But one key text here, wherein philosophy of language is still being dominant, again is Putnam, The Meaning of Meaning. And in that famous text, we get the really famous thought experiment about twin Earth, a place that's much like Earth, a hypothetical place in the cosmos that's much like Earth with creatures much like ourselves, that has some stuff that has all the surface features of water, but it's chemically different. He says, suppose its chemical composition is something that he just dubs XYZ rather than H2O. And he asks the question concerning words now, concerning terms of public language, that suppose they're speaking a language that is orthographically and auditorily just like English. There are twin earthlings who look a lot like us, and they use the word water. Is the stuff that they call water, water? Does their word that we would pronounce as water and they pronounce as water, does it mean water? Claim. No, it doesn't. The meaning of meaning. Its meaning is partially determined, is very, very largely determined by whatever is the natural kind of stuff that they are referring to. And it's different. Okay, so that's a key thought experiment. Right about this time, philosophy of mind is starting to move to center stage, starting to displace philosophy of language and its centrality. And a prominent distinction begins to emerge now between sensory experiential states on the one hand, the kind that Smart and Place were especially concerned about as wanting to individuate them differently than the way analytical behaviorism individuated other kinds of mental states. And then other sorts of mental states, typically classified under the category propositional attitudes, beliefs, desires, and the like. And two broad issues now start to crystallize. One concerns the what its likeness or intrinsic phenomenal character of certain kinds of mental states. And it was really common at the time, I think, to suppose that it was mainly and maybe merely sensory perceptual experiences that have this intrinsic what its likeness, this intrinsic phenomenality. And such states came to be referred to as qualia. And on the other hand, there were states that by their nature are intentional. They have some representational content or aboutness. These were the propositional attitudes. And so one kind of worry was, can we locate qualia, intrinsic what its likeness type states within a broadly materialistic metaphysic of mind? And people were thinking functionalism won't do the job there, because of the essence of a mental state, if it's only functional, is entirely a relational thing, a matter of, its essence qua mental is just how it is causally connected to other such states, to sensory inputs and to behavioral outputs, whereas what its likeness is intrinsic. So people were worried about incorporating genuine phenomenality into a broadly materialist picture of the mind, and they thought that the functionalist way of going won't work for qualia. Now, many such worriers about qualia did think that a broadly functionalist approach would work for propositional attitudes. And there was a tendency in this time period to suppose that phenomenality is not intentional, that qualia don't have representational content. And there was a tendency to think of intentional mental states as being understandable in functionalist terms, maybe in a Putnam-style second-order functionalist way, or maybe in the what I call first-order functionalist identity theory way of Lewis and Armstrong. So at this time, there was a tendency toward what Teenson and I came to dub separatism. On the one hand, you've got intentional mental states, and on the other hand, you have non-intentional sensory phenomenal states, and they are distinct. Now, Fodor becomes a really central figure, late 60s, early 70s, and he incorporates morals that he's taking from Putnam about language and wants to say, well, probably the more fundamental kind of intentionality is mental as opposed to linguistic. We turn away from language as central toward the intentionality of mind. Fodor was quite clearly a strong separatist. He thought, well, there are qualia with their intrinsic what its likeness. We don't know what to say about them from a materialist point of view. We need a new Einstein to understand them. But we can do better when it comes to propositional attitude type mental states with intentionality. But he thought we got important lessons from Putnam. Putnam teaches us that there are aspects of content that depend constitutively on how you're connected to your wider environment. This is a lesson of Putnam's paper, The Meaning of Meaning. So in one phase, Fodor is wanting to say, what this tells us is that there are two kinds of intentionality, and they're both pervasive and systematic. There's so-called narrow content, which he was initially thinking of as explicable in terms of kind of a traditional functionalist picture, namely the essence of a narrow content mental state is its functional role, which is a matter of how it is causally connected to other internal such states and to sensory inputs and behavioral outputs. We don't have to go outside the organism. But then there's wide content, which depends constitutively in part on the wider environment. And in this period, he thought, well, there are both kinds of content. They're both systematic and pervasive. And to understand wide content, we're going to have to say something about connections between the critter and the critter's environment. But as time goes on, people start having worries and doubts about this notion of narrow content, usually they're thinking of it in ways that have nothing to do with phenomenality. They're setting aside the phenomenal, the intrinsic, what its likeness, attributing that to the sensory. And Fodor, for instance, says that's a different ball game. I don't know what to say about that. But then if you're thinking of content as narrow, but you're also thinking of it entirely in functional terms, it begins to look as though, oh, it's pretty elusive what this content could possibly be. You know, functional connections of internal states to other internal states and to sensory inputs and behavioral outputs. What do you mean sensory inputs and behavioral outputs? Well, if you think about sensory inputs in rather crude physicalistic terms, you know, physical stimulations of sense organs on the inside. And if you think of behavioral outputs in rather raw bodily motion terms, you know, ways that the body moves, for example, we're not really getting any intentionality, are we? And more people start to think that all mental intentionality is constitutively dependent on connections between what goes on inside the head and what's happening in the creature's wider ambient environment. And Fodor himself makes this move as well. He starts advocating a sort of a systematic content externalism. He gives up on the notion of narrow content. I think a key text here was this book called The Elm and the Expert. And this broadly externalist view of mental intentionality becomes really dominant. It becomes something of a cottage industry in philosophy of mind. People have different stories about what the constitutive connections need to be between what goes on internally to the head and what goes on in the wider environment in order for those head internal states to have their content. Broadly speaking, it was some sort of functionalist picture, but now it's what has sometimes been called long-armed functionalism, because the constitutive causal connections now reach out into the environment. One dominant kind of idea was that, well, intentionality arises by virtue of systematic covariational linkages between what happens out there and what happens in here. My concept dog refers to dogs because of systematic covariations between the presence of dogs in my environment and internal states in me that are triggered by the presence of dogs, you know, via my perceptual apparatus. Another kind of broadly functionalist, externalist conception of mental content came to be called teleofunctionalism, associated with Ruth Millikan and Fred Dretske. The idea was that, well, the really important systematic covariational connections that generate mental intentionality have arisen in evolutionary history. And they're now in us as a product of how we humans have evolved. So it has a lot more to do with covariations between what happened in the environment and what happened internally in our evolutionary ancestors, and less to do with how it works in ourselves. Or you could try to generate a lot of it in terms of our own individual learning history. Dretske tended more that way, I'd say. Millikan was more of a sort of pure evolutionary type. But everybody in this period is thinking about content as constitutively externalist. They're giving up on the whole idea of narrow internal content. So what happens in terms of how received wisdom comes to arise in philosophy of mind in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and to a large extent, right on down to the present? There's a tendency to think that all mental content is a matter of some kind of constitutive, systematic connection between internal states and wider environmental phenomena. So systematic content externalism about mental intentionality. And then when it comes to the systematic, well, not everybody is a separatist. What do you want to say about the connection between the kinds of states that are widely recognized to be intentional, like beliefs and desires, and the kinds of states that were often called qualia, like sensory experiences. Here, I think you had two kinds of views. So there were two forms of received wisdom that were in competition. One would be the kind of picture Fodor had, strongly separatist. Qualia, in states with phenomenality like sensory experiences, they're a different matter. They are not to be understood entirely in terms of causal functional essence. They have an intrinsic mental what its likeness. That's their phenomenality. But that's non-intentional on this picture. So you've got non-intentional qualia, and whether and how to understand how they could arise in the physical world, that's an issue. And for Fodor, that was a deep mystery. We need a new Einstein to understand qualia. And then there's the non-phenomenal intentional mental states like beliefs and desires and the like. We can give a broadly long-armed functionalist story about them by embracing some kinds of systematic externalism about mental content, mental intentionality. So that's one kind of received view, separatism, and which embraces long-armed functionalist, strongly externalist conception of content. Then there was another popular view that came to be a kind of received view, I would say, that called itself representationalism. To my mind, this is an example of the tyranny of terminology, because there are other kinds of views, like mine, that could perfectly well be called representationalism. But these folks grabbed the label. People like Michael Tye, Bill Lycan, and Fred Dretske as well. The idea was that the phenomenal, they did tend to think that the phenomenal was largely limited to sensory experiential mental states, or maybe those plus some similar ones like mental imagery and possibly emotional states, certainly not beliefs and desires. But they tended to think that these are distinctive, and phenomenality is distinctive by being a certain special kind of representation. So phenomenality is intentional on this kind of view, but it's intentional in a distinctive sort of way. And although it is a distinctive sort of way that needs to be somehow characterized as different from the intentionality of beliefs and desires, we can still understand its content in broadly externalist way. So, for example, Tye talked about phenomenal states as having what he called panic. This PANIC was a sort of acronym for poised, abstract, non-conceptual, intentional content. So these kinds of people often try to distinguish between what they called conceptual and non-conceptual intentionality. And both kinds were to be given a broadly functionalist, long-armed functionalist separatist treatment. So they were reductive about phenomenality. They wanted to reduce what its likeness to a certain kind of representational character understood functionally. Okay, let me just mention some ironies about a very common way of thinking about sensory perceptual mental states. The idea that qualia are non-intentional, that sensory, what its likeness, is not an intentional matter. What were some of the prototypical examples? Well, things like experiencing red, for example, and experiencing pain, the what it's like of red experiences. Well, red experiences are experiences that present redness as a feature distributed on the surface of external objects. Red experiences are, if you just think about it for a second, they're obviously intentional. Red experiences represent redness as a property of external objects. Pain experiences, well, they have to do with with your own body, but don't pain experiences represent certain parts of your body as being in certain kinds of distressful states, right? A pain in your toe represents something going on in your toe. It's intentional, right? So it's rather ironic in retrospective reflection that people tended to think of the intrinsic what it's likeness of sensory experience as non-intentional. That's not really what it's like at all. And now you start to get dissonant voices about the kinds of mental states that were regarded as paradigmatically intentional, like beliefs and desires. You start to see people in the analytic tradition saying, well, if you think about it, isn't there an intrinsic what it's likeness to these kinds of states as well? Galen Strawson, Colin McGinn, Charles Seward, David Pitt, Cody Farkas, Teenson and me, and our colleague George Graham, and others. And one kind of thought experiment that really, I think, moved a lot of people, perhaps more in the way that David was mentioning in his talk, more by way of exhibiting the phenomenon than by way of constituting an argument, although some of us have wanted to use these phenomena in an argumentative way, are examples like Galen's example of two people sitting side by side, both hearing the same spoken language. But one of them understands the language, say it's Russian, and the other one doesn't. The thought is, isn't there a really dramatic difference between what it's like to hear spoken Russian when you understand Russian and what it's like to hear spoken Russian when you don't? But the raw sensory aspect of the what it's likeness is presumably the same in both cases. You're getting the same sounds and so forth. Well, I mean, actually, there are levels of difference. There's also perhaps a difference in parsing the sounds syntactically. I think, you could be able to do that without understanding the words. But, there's a really dramatic difference when we start incorporating the what it's like of the understanding aspect. So there's understanding phenomenology. Now, one thing that has always moved me a lot, and that did come up in papers that I wrote with John, and sometimes with John and George Graham, involves just reflecting on classic thought experiments like the Cartesian evil demon, the Cartesian thought experiment involving the perfectly vivid dream, the contemporary version of this, the always already envatted brain. So if you think about an envatted brain whose brain activity throughout its entire existence is just like yours, are you envisioning a creature that is only like you with respect to raw sensory phenomenological what its likeness and nothing else? Well, no. You're envisioning a creature that's just like you systematically with respect to its mental life. Now, ex hypothesi, it doesn't have any of the constitutive externalistic connections to the wider environment that came to be forms of the received view about mental intentionality. It's not connected in any of the appropriate ways to the wider environment, but it's got a mental life to a very, very great extent exactly matches your own, both in terms of sensory perceptual experience, but also in terms of consciousness writ large, conscious beliefs, conscious desires, conscious intentions, and so forth. So I've always regarded the clear intelligibility of the Cartesian thought experiment as making plain the extent to which conscious experience is shot through with an inherent what its likeness, including conscious thinking and conscious desiring and conscious intention formation and the like. So here's a version of a phenomenal intentionality picture. This is the kind of picture that Teenson and Graham and I have. Separatism is quite wrong. paradigmatically phenomenological states like sensory experiences are in fact richly intentional. And paradigmatically intentional states like beliefs and desires, in fact, have a distinctive and constitutive and proprietary phenomenology. Now, there's a purely phenomenal, completely narrow sort of phenomenal intentionality that you share in common with your brain in a vat phenomenal duplicates and with your twin earth phenomenal duplicate. It includes very rich cognitive phenomenology. It includes very rich agentive phenomenology. Now, some, but not all, intentional mental states also have a second kind of intentionality that we call externalistic intentionality. For example, thoughts about individuals like Trump, or thoughts about natural kinds like water, okay? But that doesn't mean that all states, all intentional mental states have externalistic intentionality in addition to the narrow kind. Some do. The ones that involve, for example, concepts of individuals or concepts of natural kinds. So your twin earths phenomenal duplicate has a mentality that's phenomenally intentionally just like yours, but it has different externalistic intentionality. It doesn't think about Trump. It thinks about twin Trump, and has the thought, if this is my duplicate, or at least let's take the propositional attitude of hoping that. What I hope is that right after Joe Biden gets sworn in as president, and I'm assuming that Donald will still be in the White House and belligerently refusing to leave, he will not only be escorted out, but he will promptly be arrested. That's what I'm hoping. Now, my twin earth phenomenal duplicate has an exactly phenomenally similar hope, but it's not about Trump. It's about twin Trump. What about my brain in a vat phenomenal duplicate? Well, my brain in a vat phenomenal duplicate has thought constituents that purport to refer. For example, it has a thought constituent that purports to refer to an individual with Trump-like features named Trump, but it doesn't refer at all. So there's systematic non-veridicality because your brain in a vat phenomenal duplicate lacks externalistic intentionality altogether. And another part of this picture is that although there is such a thing as externalistic intentionality, it is heavily constrained by phenomenal intentionality. So some people want to say, well, I think David Chalmers wants to say, for example, that my twin earth phenomenal duplicate has Trump thoughts, no, not my twin earth, I'm sorry, my brain in a vat phenomenal duplicate has Trump thoughts that really do refer, but they refer to the state of the computer that is controlling the inputs to the brain in a vat. On the Horgan-Tinson Grandview, that's a non-starter because the reference eligibility for the thought constituent that the linguistic expression Trump picks out, reference eligibility is so strongly constrained by phenomenal intentionality that a state of a computer couldn't possibly be the referent of the thought constituent expressed by the word Trump. Why do we call it a form of intentionality? David said that he doesn't want to do that. He wants to distinguish reference from intentionality. I remember that John said similar things to me when we were working out this view. John was not so inclined to use the word intentionality for that. And what I said was, well, the way the word intentionality most typically gets glossed in analytic philosophy is as aboutness. Well, reference is a form of aboutness. And so this was partly by way of a concession to what's commonly said about what's called intentionality, that I urge that we refer to this as externalistic intentionality. And I guess, well, in the end, John agreed But I note that he was initially somewhat unhappy about that. So some people think there's a hard problem of phenomenal consciousness. This is famously the phrase coined by David Chalmers. Sometimes it's called the apparent explanatory gap. Why should there be any such thing as intrinsic phenomenality in the physical world at all? Why should there be any what it's likeness? Why should the brain states that we undergo have the distinctive what it's likeness that they have associated with them rather than other kinds or none at all? Well, Tainson and Graham and I want to say, okay, maybe there is a hard problem of phenomenal consciousness, but the whole hard problem of phenomenal consciousness includes phenomenally constituted narrow intentionality, and that encompasses rich cognitive phenomenology and also very rich agentive phenomenology, the what it's like of experiencing yourself as an originator of your own behavior. Okay, I'm done.
All right, thank you very much. So let's see. Let me ask you a quick question. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start our next session 10 minutes later than planned and go another 10 minutes. So that'll be 11:25 to 12:55. And that'll give us time for a few questions now. And then I wanted to give everyone about a 5-minute break. So I see a couple hands. Let's maybe to be fair, if you can raise your chat hand in the chat window, if you know how to do that. If you look at the you open your participant window and you go to the More button, which has 3 dots. I think that's one way to do it, and then you can just raise a hand. So I see David Pitt's hand right now, so why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, David, I learned a couple of weeks ago that the 3 dots is known as a kebab.
Ah, okay, so enjoy the kebab.
So Harry, I guess I wanted to just clarify, and maybe this was what John was thinking too. I don't want to resist I mean, it's terminological maybe. I don't want to resist saying that aboutness also includes reference. What I want to resist is the idea that content, in the sense that of what's expressed by a that clause, as Laura would put it. There's 2 kinds of that, right? So it's not that I don't want to deny that reference and truth conditions and truth values are important and that they're semantic properties. What explicitly I wanted to deny was a bifurcation on the if you think in terms of sense and reference, right? The idea that, well, there's 2 kinds of senses. Right, there's the kind of sense that's determined internally and the kind of sense that's determined externally. And then there's also reference. So what I want to deny, and I think what John's initial intuition was on the basis of your description, was also wanting to deny that bifurcation of sense, you might.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good. That's something that I think George Graham and I should about and work more on than we have so far. So I will take that under serious advisement.
Great, thanks.
I want to talk to you some more about this.
Sure, anytime.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I think Remy had a question in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was saying Remy had a question in the chat, so I don't
I had a question in the chat, yeah, and sorry, I'm keeping my camera off. I burned my finger on my coffee cup this morning, and I'm in an awkward position with it stuck in water. So this is just a basic question about terminology here, and the use of the term of entertaining a thought or entertaining a belief. And I'm just trying to make sure I understand what that means, because on the one hand, I could understand that as being, I hear it as a synonym for what it is to experience a thought or a belief, right? When you entertain it, sort of consciously to experience it, versus something that would be more reflective, right? Like an intentional examination of one's own belief or whatnot. So you might say that when I'm entertaining a thought, I'm thinking about it consciously, aware that I'm thinking about it, versus just the phenomenology of having it present in my mind, right? If that makes sense, in a first order sense. So I'm just curious about the terminology and which way that term is being used.
What we have in mind is primarily the first thing. It's one thing for there to be a what it's like of just undergoing a current thought consciously. And indeed, we wanted to say that there are different aspects of the what it's like. There's a what it's like of entertaining that particular content. And there's also a what it's like of holding a specific attitude toward that content. You know, it could be belief, it could be desire, it could be suspicion, it could be hope or whatever, or just hypothetically supposition. Now, the second thing I think of as a higher order state directed on the first order state. You know, you are attending to your first order state, maybe you're forming beliefs about it. So what we have in mind was the first thing, just what it's like of undergoing the thought.
Okay.
The terminology of the Continentals here, they use the word pre-reflective, and I like that terminology here. What we're talking about first and foremost is the pre-reflective phenomenology of thought experiences.
That's helpful. That's the way that I was hearing it, and the way that I used it a few times in other contexts.
Yeah.
So that's good. I'm glad that what I'm hearing is matching. Thanks.
Good.
I think Sean has a question.
Yeah, thanks. Going back to David Pitt's presentation, but it's also something Terry might chime in on. There is something that is like to think. I totally agree with that. Would you say also that there are different kinds of thinking? So I could be solving a math problem, and there's something like, you know, what it's like to solve a math problem. There's something it's like to imagine a scenario or to remember something. And are there differences between imagining and memory? So these kinds of modalities of intentionality, do you find differences between them? And then it seems to me possible that you could describe those differences if you actually experience them. But I wonder what David would think about that.
Yeah. So when I talk about thinking, I don't mean necessarily engaging in a process of reasoning about a particular subject matter. I just mean the phenomenology of a thought occurring. So the phenomenology of thinking for me, the phenomenology of thinking, if you speak, you're a monolingual speaker of Chinese, is going to be different from the phenomenology of engaging in acts of thinking if you're monolingual speaker of English. But I would want to say that there's a common phenomenology there, which is the phenomenology of grasping the thought or grasping a proposition. So by thinking, I just mean it's something that could involve just a single thought, if that helps.
David, so just go further on that point. You take it that the phenomenology is fine-grained as narrow content, though, right?
Yes.
Yeah, because it's co-constituting, or
what does that mean?
The phenomenology and the intentionality are co-constitutive in terms of.
Well, I think they're identical. Yeah.
Okay.
So do I.
So it would be so phenomenology and entertaining thoughts could be individuated by the narrow, or it's as fine-grained as the narrow content could be individuated.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's individuated as finely as thought.
Yeah.
I would add something here that ties back to what I said yesterday in answer to Tom Neenan. I think it's important to bear in mind that there's a distinction here between the, why am I blocking on the terminology all of a sudden? Determinables and determinates of determinables. So for example, a thought type, a content type as a content type is a determinable, and there are various different determinate specific phenomenal states that could involve that content, right? And so there can be variation across determinants of the same determinable.
What you mean for cognitive phenomenology?
I mean for all phenomenology, and I also people sometimes worry about how for example, in a given case, there can be some specific kind of sensory experiential phenomenology that's tied in rather closely. Maybe you're doing some content relevant imaging when you're having a current thought. And now, what's the connection between that imagistic phenomenology as a type and the current content phenomenology as a type? They might diverge somewhat as types, as determinables, but the specific determinate here and now phenomenal intentional state has both aspects. And at that level, we should talk the language of identity, as you did.
So would you agree with the following? So just like there's only one way to experience a maximally determinate shade of red, say, there's only one way to think, for example, that democracy is a form of government. In the sense that you might think that in different languages, but that auditory or visual linguistic phenomenology is not part of the content of the thought. So I thought you were saying that, look, there can be different ways to think that democracy is a form of government independently of what language you speak or what images you have or what associations. And that's something that I would want to disagree with.
I see. Well, another looming issue that I guess you didn't mention in your typology, but I think it is there, that involves certain kinds of branch points or choice points, concerns whether you think it makes sense to talk about a really pure phenomenology of thought. Could there be, can we make sense of experience that is purely thought phenomenological and has no sensory or quasi-sensory or imagistic aspect to it at all? Some people will say yes to that, and some people will be dubious about it. I'm sort of dubious about it.
I say yes to it.
Yeah.
So I think, look, it might be that humans are really not really all that good at thinking, and we need language to help us think. And it might be that for human beings, certain sorts of supportive phenomenology are necessary, but that doesn't mean to having a thought or to thinking about something, but that doesn't mean that phenomenology is constitutive of what you're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to have to take a break right now. So everyone has a little break, and then we're going to be starting with Michelle Montague's session in a few minutes. So I said we'll start at 11:25, but let's just move that to 11:30 so that everyone has a chance to take a break, and we'll reconvene in a minute.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.